She had spent the last 36 hours on her feet, moving from one windowless room to another, deep within the confines of the Naval Operations Center. The air in those rooms was always the same, recycled, sterile, and thick with the unspoken pressure of men and women who knew that a single wrong decision could cost billions of dollars in hardware and, more importantly, lives. She was a captain, one of the youngest to ever hold the billet she currently occupied. Her days were a blur of satellite imagery, intelligence briefs, and the constant, low-level hum of machinery that tracked every significant wave on every ocean. She commanded not just ships, but the very concept of American naval presence. Yet, as she stepped out of the steel and glass monolith into the humid Norfolk evening, the weight of those 3 decades of service seemed to slide from her shoulders, replaced by the simple, bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who hadn't seen her own apartment in 2 days. She drove on autopilot, not towards the quiet suburb where she lived, but towards the bright lights of the Virginia Beach Strip. She wasn't looking for company, not really. She was looking for anonymity. In uniform, she was a rank, a position, a set of medals on a chest. In civilian clothes, a simple navy blue blouse and comfortable slacks, she was just another woman looking for a quiet corner, a basket of hot wings, and a beer she didn't have to drink alone in her kitchen. The bar was loud, exactly as she expected. A college football game played on dozens of screens, their light casting a flickering glow over a sea of faces. It was the kind of place where people came to forget their 9 to 5, a place where no one asked what you did for a living because they were too busy talking about themselves. She found a spot at the far end of the bar, away from the main crowd, a small island of relative quiet in a sea of noise. She ordered a local lager and some food, pulling out her phone only to scroll mindlessly through news articles she would never remember reading. She just wanted to be a ghost for an hour, to let the noise wash over her without absorbing any of it. For a while, it worked. The bartender, a busy woman with a kind smile, kept an eye on her but left her alone. The anonymity was blissful. It was shattered by a hard shove against her shoulder. The impact was sharp, unexpected, and nearly knocked her off the bar stool. Her beer sloshed. And wetting her hand and the polished wood of the bar, she turned, a flash of hot anger cutting through her fatigue, to find a man already past her, his back now to her as he tried to force his way into a conversation with 2 other men. He was broad-shouldered, with the telltale signs of a life spent in the gym, a thick neck and a military-style high-and-tight haircut. He hadn't even looked back. To him, she was just an obstacle, a piece of furniture in his way. "Excuse you," she said, her voice cutting through the bar noise with a clarity honed by decades of giving orders on windswept flight decks. The man turned, a look of annoyance flashing across his face. He was a Marine, that much was clear. She could read the culture in his posture, his confidence, the specific way he wore his civilian clothes like a uniform. And he was probably a staff sergeant or a gunnery sergeant, used to being a big fish in the relatively small pond of his unit. He looked her up and down, a quick, dismissive assessment. He saw a woman sitting alone, nursing a beer, looking tired. He saw a civilian. "Relax, ma'am," he said, the ma'am dripping with a condescension that was far worse than a curse word. "It's a bar. People move around." He turned back to his buddies, completely dismissing her. The anger subsided as quickly as it had come, replaced by a cold, calm clarity. She had faced down admirals in heated strategy meetings. She had stood on the bridge during simulated combat scenarios where the tension was so thick you could choke on it. This man's rudeness was a pebble on a beach. More than that, it was a gift. In his complete and utter disregard. And he had given her exactly what she had come here for, anonymity. He didn't see the 4 gold stripes on a dress blue uniform sleeve. He didn't see the command insignia. He just saw a woman he could push aside. It was, in a strange way, the most relaxing thing that had happened to her all week. She wiped up the spilled beer with a napkin, took a slow sip from the now half-full glass, and let the Marine's existence fade from her immediate consciousness. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The 2 men he had been so eager to talk to weren't interested in him. They shrugged him off, turning back to their own conversation. Deflated, the Marine scanned the bar for another target, and his eyes landed back on her. Perhaps it was the lack of reaction that intrigued him, or perhaps he was simply the type of man who couldn't stand being ignored. He sauntered back over, leaning against the bar next to her with a grin that he probably thought was charming. "Sorry about that," he said, his tone shifting to something he likely considered friendly. "It's a madhouse in here. You come here often?" She didn't look up from her phone. "Not really. You should try the wings. Best in the city." He was pushing now, his voice taking on a slightly aggressive, salesman-like quality. "Me and the guys come here all the time. We're with 2nd Marine Division. Good people." She finally looked at him, her expression neutral. "I'm sure they are." He missed the cue entirely, the clear signal that she wasn't interested in conversation. He saw her lack of hostility as an invitation. He pulled out the stool next to her, then its legs scraping loudly against the floor. "You look like you could use some company. Tougher crowd than you expected?" He laughed at his own joke, a loud, barking sound. It was then that the bartender approached, setting a basket of wings and a fresh beer in front of her. "Here you go, ma'am. And the gentleman at the end of the bar wanted to send this over, said it looked like you'd had a long day." The captain looked down the bar to see an older man in a worn baseball cap raise his glass to her in a simple, respectful toast. She smiled and raised her own glass in thanks. It was a small gesture of human kindness, a stark contrast to the awkward, pushy presence beside her. The Marine, oblivious to the silent exchange, leaned in. "So, what do? You in the area or just visiting?" She took a bite of her wing, chewing slowly, deliberately. "I'm in the Navy," she said, the words simple and unadorned. His face lit up. He had his in. "No kidding, I knew it. I can always spot a fellow service member. What's your rate? Supply? Admin?" He was guessing the jobs he associated with women in the Navy. The support roles. "Something like that," she said, wiping her fingers on a napkin. He leaned closer and she caught a whiff of cheap cologne mixed with beer. "You know, it's tough for women in the Navy. A lot of politics. You gotta know the right people to get anywhere. Me, I'm different. I'm a warfighter. My Marines would follow me into hell. You get a lot of that in the support world? People not taking you seriously?" She looked at him then, really looked at him. She saw the desperate need for validation, the insecurity that drove him to belittle others, to elevate himself. She saw the narrowness of a world view that couldn't conceive of a woman having a role more complex than his own. And she felt a profound sense of pity. He had no idea who he was talking to. He had no idea that the woman he had just pushed aside and was now condescending to was responsible for the movements of the very ships that would carry him and his Marines to hell, and hopefully back again. "You'd be surprised," she said softly, more to herself than to him. She finished her beer and placed some cash on the bar. "The check, please, whenever you're ready," she called to the bartender. The Marine, misreading her movement as a sign that he was losing his audience, scrambled. "Hey, wait, don't go. The night's young. Tell you what, I'll show you around. Introduce you to some real operators. It'll be an education." She finally turned to face him fully. "I don't need an education on operators, Sergeant. I need to get some sleep." She stood up, sliding the strap of her small bag over her shoulder. The specificity of the rank gave him a moment's pause, but he shook it off. "How'd you know I was a sergeant?" "Just a guess," she said, her voice flat. As she waited for the bartender to run her card, the Marine's two friends finally wandered over. They were more relaxed, more professional-looking than their boisterous companion. One of them glanced at the captain and did a double-take. It wasn't recognition, not exactly. It was the look of a trained observer trying to place a familiar face. He stared for a moment longer than was polite, his brow furrowed. The captain met his gaze. And for a split second, her mask slipped. She wasn't the tired woman at the bar anymore. In her eyes was the cool, commanding authority of someone used to being instantly obeyed. The junior Marine looked away first, unsettled. The first Marine, oblivious to this exchange, made one last, desperate play. As she signed the receipt, he said, "All right, well, at least tell me your name. Maybe we'll run into each other again." She picked up her copy of the receipt, folded it neatly, and tucked it into her bag. She looked at him, a small, humorless smile playing on her lips. "I doubt that very much." She turned and walked out of the bar, leaving the three Marines behind her. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She was heading home to her empty apartment, to a few hours of sleep before she had to go back and resume command of the Armada. And the encounter was already a fading memory, a minor ripple in the vast ocean of her responsibilities. For her, the night was over. But for the Marine who had pushed her aside, the night was about to take a turn he could never have anticipated. The morning after the bar incident, the captain was back in her natural habitat. The sterile, fluorescent lights of the headquarters building had replaced the dim, warm glow of the bar. The low hum of ventilation systems had supplanted the roar of the college football crowd. She sat at the head of a long conference table, a steaming mug of black coffee at her elbow, a stack of briefing books open before her. The fatigue that had clung to her the night before was gone, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of a commander preparing for a major operation. Across the table, her staff, a mix of commanders, lieutenant commanders, and senior enlisted advisors, were running through the final details of the Joint Task Force exercise, a massive multi-day event that would involve ships, aircraft, and ground forces from all branches of the military. It was the kind of complex, high-stakes evolution that tested every aspect of naval power, from logistics and communications to strike warfare and amphibious assault. "Captain, the final amphibious landing sequence has been approved by 2nd Fleet," a commander with sandy hair and a perpetually worried expression reported. "The Marines are landing at dawn on D-Day. They've requested final confirmation on the naval gunfire support windows." She nodded, scanning the relevant page in her briefing book. "Confirmed. The Ford's CSG will provide air cover. And Destroyer Squadron 22 will handle the surface threat. Ensure the fire support coordinates are sent to the Beachmaster and the Marine Air Ground Task Force Commander by 1300 today. I want no ambiguity." This was her world. A world of precision, of responsibility, of lives and machinery hanging in the balance of clear communication and decisive action. She was the nexus point, the single individual where all the disparate threads of the operation, air, surface, subsurface, and ground, came together. It was a job that required not just intelligence and experience, but a particular kind of mental fortitude. The ability to hold the entire picture in your head, to see not just the individual trees, but the whole forest, and to make decisions that shape that forest for years to come. Hours later, and after the planning session had concluded and the staff had dispersed to their respective duties, she found herself in a different room. This one was smaller, more intimate, with a large flat-screen monitor on the wall and a secure video teleconference unit. It was time for the pre-exercise brief with the senior leadership of the other services involved. The screen flickered to life, resolving into 4 squares. One showed an Air Force Major General, his uniform crisp, his face tanned. Another showed a 2-star Army general, his head shaved, his expression grim. The third was a Navy Rear Admiral, a man she knew well and respected. The 4th square was initially dark, then flashed on to reveal a Marine Corps Major General. "Good afternoon, everyone," the captain began, her voice calm and authoritative. "Thank you for your time. I'll be running through the final CONOPS for Operation Atlantic Hammer, focusing on the joint integration points we identified in last month's planning conference." She proceeded to deliver a masterful brief. For 30 minutes, she walked the flag officers through the complex plan. She spoke of carrier strike group movements, submarine patrol zones, Air Force bomber support windows, Army missile battery emplacements, and the crucial Marine Corps amphibious landing. She didn't just list facts. She wove them into a coherent narrative, demonstrating a complete mastery of every facet of the operation. She answered their questions without hesitation, offering alternatives, discussing risks, and projecting confidence. When the Army general asked a pointed question about the vulnerability of the landing force to shore-based anti-ship missiles, she didn't flinch. "Sir, that's the primary threat we've identified. To counter it, we've established a layered defense. The Air Force will have a continuous combat air patrol over the landing zone, suppressing any air threat. My surface action group will be positioned to engage missile batteries with Tomahawk cruise missiles within 2 minutes of a launch detection. And the Marines are landing with their own HIMARS units, which will be operational and providing counter-battery fire within 15 minutes of hitting the beach. The risk is mitigated to an acceptable level." The Marine Corps Major General on the screen leaned forward, his face filling his square. He was an older man, with close-cropped gray hair and a chiseled jaw. He looked at her not with the professional respect one officer gives another, but with a deeper, more focused appraisal. "Captain," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I've read your biography, impressive, but I have to admit I was expecting someone older." It was a mild jab, a test. She had faced it 100 times. "I get that a lot, sir. I try to make up for it with enthusiasm." The general almost smiled. "Fair enough. Your plan is sound. My G3 has some minor tweaks to the landing craft departure times, but nothing we can't handle at the lower level. There is, however, one thing I'd like to add." He paused, his gaze still intense. "I want my Marines to see the face of the Navy they'll be working for. I'd like you to address my battalion commanders and their senior enlisted before the operation. A personal talk. Not a briefing, a talk. Let them see who's driving the ship." It was an unusual request, but a smart one. And building personal bonds between senior leaders and the troops was one of the most effective ways to ensure seamless cooperation in the fog of war. "I'd be honored, General. Just tell me where and when." "Excellent. We're holding a pre-deployment formation at the Marine Corps base tomorrow at 1400. I'll have my aide send you the details. Captain, it's been a pleasure." The screen went dark, followed by the others. The next afternoon, she stood on a small, elevated platform at the edge of a massive parade deck at Camp Lejeune. The sun was bright, the air thick with the smell of jet fuel and the red dust of North Carolina. Before her, arrayed in precise battalion-sized formations, stood nearly 2,000 Marines. They were a sea of digital camouflage and high and tight haircuts, their faces young, serious, and alert. And this was the sharp end of the spear, the force that would hit the beach in just a few days. She was in her service dress blues, the medals on her left chest a colorful testament to a career spent in harm's way. The 4 gold stripes on her sleeves gleamed in the afternoon sun. She didn't use a microphone. Her voice, trained to carry over the roar of jet engines on a flight deck, carried easily. She didn't talk about strategy or tactics. She talked about trust. She talked about the fact that when they were on that beach, taking fire, scared and confused, there would be a ship just over the horizon with her name on it. And on that ship, there would be sailors, young men and women just like them, who would be working tirelessly to put steel on target, to provide medical evacuation, to get them home. She told them that in her 30 years of service, she had never, not once, seen a Marine fail in his or her duty, and she had no intention of being the first Navy commander to fail them. She spoke for 10 minutes, and when she finished, the silence that hung over the 2,000 Marines was more powerful than any cheer. As she stepped down from the platform, the Marine Major General from the video conference was waiting for her, a genuine smile finally cracking his stern facade. "Captain, that was exactly what they needed to hear. Thank you." He fell into step beside her as they walked towards a waiting vehicle. His aide, a young captain, walked a respectful distance behind them. As they approached the vehicle, the Major General's aide was suddenly replaced by another Marine officer. He was a gunnery sergeant. It's a senior enlisted Marine with a chest full of service ribbons. He had been tasked with opening the door for the generals. He stood ramrod straight, his eyes fixed forward, the picture of military professionalism. As the captain and the Major General drew near, the gunny reached for the door handle. Then, his gaze flickered for a fraction of a second from the horizon to the face of the Navy officer approaching him. The color drained from his face. His hand, reaching for the door, froze in midair. His eyes widened, not in fear, but in the dawning, horrifying recognition of a catastrophic mistake. It was the Marine from the bar, the one who had pushed her, the one who had bought her a drink, the one who had condescendingly offered to educate her on real operators. He was looking at the woman in the pristine dress blues, at the 4 gold stripes on her sleeve, the command insignia on her chest, the face he had dismissed as just another tired woman at a bar. She stopped walking. She looked at him. For a long, agonizing second, the 3 of them were frozen in a perfect tableau. The captain, the general, and the terrified gunnery sergeant. The general looked from the captain's face to the gunny's, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Captain, is there a problem?" She held the Marine's gaze. She saw the panic, the dawning realization of the professional catastrophe that was about to befall him. She saw the memory of his own words flash across his face. "It's tough for women in the Navy. You gotta know the right people. I'll show you around, introduce you to some real operators." She could destroy him with a single sentence. One word to the Major General, and then his career would be over. He would be the Marine who sexually harassed a Navy captain. His life's work, his identity as a warfighter, would be gone. She held the power of life and death over his career in the palm of her hand, and in that moment, she made a choice. She smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile or a knowing smile. It was a simple, almost gentle smile. "No problem at all, General," she said, her voice light. "I think the sergeant here was just about to get the door for us. Weren't you, Gunny?" The Marine snapped to attention, his voice a strangled croak. "Yes, ma'am. Of course, ma'am." He fumbled for the handle and pulled the door open. The captain climbed into the vehicle without another glance in his direction. The Major General, still looking puzzled, got in on the other side. As the car pulled away, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had just taught the most powerful lesson of his life, not with words, but with grace. She had shown him what true leadership, true power, and true class looked like. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that he would never forget it. The black staff car pulled away from the parade deck, leaving a plume of red dust in its wake. Inside, the Major General was quiet for a moment, his gaze lingering on the captain's profile. He was a man who had spent his entire life reading people, understanding the subtle dynamics of power and respect. He knew he had just witnessed something, a silent exchange that carried the weight of a classified document. "That gunnery sergeant," the general said, his voice low and even. "You know him?" The captain turned from the window, her expression serene. We met briefly. Last night, actually." The general's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "At the base? I wasn't aware you'd arrived in town until this morning." "No," she said, a slight smile touching her lips. "Not on base. At a bar in Virginia Beach. He was off duty." The general was quiet for another long moment, his mind working. He knew his Marines. He knew the kind of behavior that could emerge when they were off the leash, away from the rigid structure of the Corps. He also knew the woman sitting next to him. He had read her file, studied her career. She was not someone who tolerated disrespect or unprofessionalism. The fact that she had just covered for one of his senior non-commissioned officers, a man who, by the look on his face, had clearly done something to warrant her ire, spoke volumes. "I see," the general said slowly. "And was your encounter pleasant?" "Let's just say he had a very clear idea of my place in the world," she replied, her voice dry as the North Carolina dust. "He was eager to explain the realities of military life to a poor, lost woman in the support services. He offered to educate me on what real operators are like." The general's jaw tightened. He could fill in the blanks, the condescension, the assumption, the casual arrogance. He had seen it before, in young officers and enlisted men alike, that particular brand of toxic confidence that came from a narrow world view. He looked at the captain, this woman who commanded billions of dollars in assets and the lives of thousands of sailors, and he felt a flash of cold anger towards his own Marine. "You could have ended him," the general stated. It wasn't a question. "One word from you, and I would have had him busted down to private and cleaning latrines until his enlistment was up." "Yes," she agreed simply. "I could have." "Why didn't you?" She looked out the window again, watching the pine forests of Camp Lejeune flash by. "Because what would that have taught him? That powerful people crush those beneath them. He already knows that. He lives that. He expects that. If I had destroyed him, he would have just added it to his list of grievances. Another reason to resent the system, to resent officers, to resent women who rise above what he considers their station." She turned back to the general, her eyes clear and bright. He needed to learn something different. He needed to learn that power isn't just about rank. It's not about how loud you yell or how many people you can push around. Real power is restraint. It's the ability to absorb a blow and choose not to strike back. It's looking at someone who has dismissed you, belittled you, and treating them with dignity anyway. The general was silent, digesting her words. This was a philosophy of leadership he understood intellectually, but to see it applied in such a personal, visceral way was something else entirely. He had spent his career building warriors, teaching them to be aggressive, to dominate the battlefield. But this was a different kind of warfare, a battle fought not with rifles and artillery, but with character and grace. And he realized with a start that he had just witnessed a masterclass. Back on the parade deck, the gunnery sergeant, his name was Mark Donovan, stood frozen for a long time after the staff car disappeared. His fellow Marines milled around him, some asking if he was okay, others joking that he looked like he'd seen a ghost. He didn't hear them. He was replaying the last 30 seconds of his life on an endless loop. The moment their eyes met, the icy grip of pure terror that had seized his heart, the certainty that his career, his life, was over. And then, the smile. The simple human smile that had saved him. He had thought about her last night after she'd left the bar. He'd dismissed her as a stuck-up civilian, a waste of his considerable charm. He had bragged to his friends about the lonely older lady. He'd almost pulled. He had felt big. He had felt powerful. Now, the memory of his own words curdled in his stomach. You gotta know the right people. I'm a war fighter. I'll show you around. He had offered to mentor a woman who outranked him by more steps than he could count. He had pushed aside a four-striped captain. He had bought a drink for the commander of an entire Naval Armada. He walked back to his barracks on autopilot, his mind a whirlwind of shame, confusion, and a strange, unfamiliar emotion he couldn't quite name. It was gratitude, yes, but it was more than that. It was a fundamental shift in his perception. For his entire career, he had measured a person's worth by their rank, their job, their physical presence. A grunt was more valuable than a cook. An infantry officer was more important than a supply officer. Men were warriors. Women were something else. He had never questioned this hierarchy. It was the water he swam in. But last night, he had met a woman he'd dismissed as a nobody, and today, that same woman stood before 2,000 Marines as their equal, their superior, their lifeline. She had spoken to them not down, but across, as one warrior to another. And when she had the power to destroy him, she had chosen to let him stand. He didn't understand it. It defied every rule of the jungle he thought he lived in. That night, he sat on his bunk staring at the wall. His roommates came and went, but he didn't move. He thought about calling his father, a retired cop, to ask for advice, but he didn't know how to explain what had happened without sounding like a complete idiot. He thought about going to the chaplain, but he wasn't religious. He just sat there, alone with the wreckage of his own arrogance. Meanwhile, across the base, the captain was attending a small, informal dinner with the major general and his senior staff. The conversation was easy, professional. They discussed the upcoming exercise, the political climate in the region, the challenges of maintaining readiness with a shrinking budget. She was in her element. One of the boys, if the boys happened to be a collection of the most experienced and lethal military minds in the country. No one mentioned the incident with the gunnery sergeant. The general had filed it away, a data point in his ever-evolving understanding of leadership. As the dinner wound down, the general's aide, the young captain, approached her. "Ma'am, I have a message for you. It was delivered to the base headquarters about an hour ago." She took the small envelope, slightly confused. No one knew she was here, and other than her staff and the people in this room. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of plain paper with a handwritten note. It read, "Ma'am, I don't have the right words. I don't know what to say. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. I understand what you were trying to show me. I'll spend the rest of my career trying to be worthy of the lesson you taught me today. Thank you for not destroying me. Thank you for showing me what a real leader looks like. Respectfully, Guy S.G.T. Mark Donovan, U.S.M.C." She read the note twice. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She didn't show it to anyone. It was a private thing, a small seed of change planted in the rocky soil of a stubborn heart. She didn't know if it would grow into anything. She didn't know if Donovan would truly change, or if the shame would just fester into resentment. But for now, in this moment, it was enough. It was proof that her choice, the harder choice, the choice to show grace instead of wrath, had been the right one. As she rejoined the conversation, she felt a small, quiet sense of peace. The operation hadn't even begun, and already she had won a victory more meaningful than any battle at sea. Dawn broke over the Atlantic, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. On the bridge of the amphibious assault ship, the captain stood watching the horizon. Below deck, thousands of sailors and Marines were going through their final pre-landing rituals. The air hummed with a tension that was almost palpable, the focused energy of an immense machine preparing to go to war. Operation Atlantic Hammer was underway. From her position, she had a god's-eye view of the armada she commanded. To the east, the gray silhouette of a Los Angeles-class submarine cut through the water, a silent predator already in position. To the north, the massive deck of the carrier Gerald R. Ford was a blur of motion as aircraft were catapulted into the sky, their afterburners leaving trails of heat in the cool morning air. Destroyers and cruisers formed a protective ring around the amphibious task force, their radar arrays spinning, their missile cells loaded and ready. It was a breathtaking display of American naval power, a floating city of steel and firepower, and it was all under her command. "Captain, the Air Force has established cap overhead. All tracks are clean," a young lieutenant at a radar console reported. "Very well," she replied, her voice calm. "Comms, I open a fleet-wide channel." She picked up a handset, and her voice was piped into every command center, every bridge, every berthing compartment across the dozens of ships she controlled. "All hands, this is the Commodore. We are commencing execution of Operation Atlantic Hammer. For the next 72 hours, we will operate as a single integrated fighting force. The mission is complex, the enemy is unknown, but the objective is simple. We put the Marines on that beach. We support them, and we bring them home. Trust your training, trust your shipmates, and trust the team. That is all." On the beach, the first waves of amphibious assault vehicles were churning through the surf, their tracked hulls throwing up plumes of white water. In the skies, F-35s from the carrier and F-22s from the Air Force screamed overhead, a moving canopy of steel. The exercise was a symphony of destruction, a carefully choreographed ballet of modern warfare. On board one of the landing craft packed to the gunwales with Marines, Gunnery Sergeant Mark Donovan felt the familiar lurch of his stomach as the craft hit a wave. He was a section leader, responsible for dozens of young men and women who were about to hit a hostile beach for the first time. He scanned their faces, seeing the fear they tried to hide, the bravado they tried to project. He thought of all the times he had stood before them, puffing out his chest, talking about being a war fighter, about the softness of the support troops, about the primacy of the infantry. The words felt hollow now, like cheap medals pinned to an empty uniform. The ramp of the landing craft slammed down, and the world exploded into noise and simulated chaos. "Go! Go! Go!" he roared, his voice cutting through the thunder. His Marines poured off the craft, fanning out across the beach, returning fire at the simulated enemy positions. He moved with them, his M4 shouldered his training, taking over. But in the back of his mind, a new thought was present, a constant low hum beneath the adrenaline. He saw the smoke from the naval gunfire support, the precise rounds landing just ahead of his advance, clearing the way. He saw the silhouette of the ships on the horizon, those massive, ungainly vessels that had seemed so irrelevant to his world just days ago. Now he saw them differently. He saw them not as floating targets, but as mobile artillery batteries, as hospitals, as supply depots, as the only thing standing between his Marines and being completely cut off and overrun. They weren't just the Navy, they were his lifeline. Hours later, the exercise entered a critical phase. A simulated communications blackout had been initiated, cutting off the beach from the ships. The forward air controller with Donovan's unit was frantically trying to re-establish a link to call in close air support against a simulated enemy armor column that was bearing down on their position. Without air support, the exercise would be over. They would be destroyed. Donovan watched the controller's frustration mount. He looked at the faces of his young Marines who didn't know it was a simulation, who were playing their roles with terrifying earnestness. He thought of the captain's words at the pre-deployment formation. There will be a ship just over the horizon. He looked at the ships. They were there. He could see them. They were just silent. Then an idea, crazy and desperate, popped into his head. He grabbed a satellite phone from his radio operator. It was a non-standard channel, a backup that was usually ignored in favor of primary tactical nets. He dialed a number he didn't know he had memorized, the base operator from Camp Lejeune who could patch him through to somewhere. "Get me the command ship," he barked at the bewildered operator when he got through. "Get me the Commodore's bridge. This is Gunnery Sergeant Donovan, 2nd Marine Division. It's an operational emergency." The connection crackled, jumped through a dozen relays, and then, impossibly, a voice came on the line. It was calm, clear, and utterly familiar. "This is the Commodore. Go ahead." Donovan's breath caught in his throat. He had expected to reach a junior watch officer, someone who would take a message. He hadn't expected to hear her voice. He didn't have time to process the shock. "Ma'am, this is GYSGCT Donovan. We are black on comms with the FAC. We have a simulated armor column, grid coordinates Whiskey 7421, approaching our position at speed. We need air now or we are combat ineffective." There was a pause of less than a second. On the bridge of the command ship, the captain didn't hesitate. She didn't ask who he was, how he got this number, or why he was calling on a non-secure line. She just processed the information. "Confirmed, Gunny. Stand by." She turned to her air warfare coordinator. "I need 2 F-18S from the CAP over to Grid Whiskey 7421. Simulated bombs on a simulated armor column." Now." 2 minutes later, the roar of jet engines shook the beach. 2 Hornets dropped from the sky, their wings swept back and screamed low over the tree line. In the cockpit of the lead aircraft, the pilot flipped a switch, and a simulated ordnance release was logged in the exercise computer. On the ground, the exercise controllers, hidden in a bunker, looked at their screens. The enemy armor column was gone. The Marines were safe. The exercise continued. On the beach, Donovan lowered the satellite phone. He stared at the ships on the horizon. He had called, and she had answered. Not because of his rank, not because of his job, but because he was a Marine in need, and she was a Navy captain whose job was to support the Marines. She had trusted the information, even from an unorthodox source, and she had acted. It was the most profound lesson in joint operations he would ever receive. The exercise concluded successfully later that day. The Marines secured the beach, the Navy moved on to the next phase, and the Armada sailed into the sunset of another training day. But for Gunnery Sergeant Donovan, something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer just a Marine. He was part of a team, a vast, complex, and beautiful team that stretched from the bottom of the ocean to the edge of space. And at the center of that team, for this operation at least, was a woman he had once dismissed with a shove. Weeks later, back at Camp Lejeune, Donovan walked into the office of his battalion commander. He requested a formal meeting, and when he sat down across the desk from the lieutenant colonel, he didn't ask for a promotion or a transfer. He asked for something far more unusual. He asked to be assigned as a liaison,